Rust Belt Riders' mission is to feed people, not landfills. We've been around since 2014. We started as a very small operation. Sometimes when we introduce ourselves, people think we're a motorcycle gang. We are not a motorcycle gang. The reason for the name is we began on a really small scale by hauling food scraps from local restaurants and other businesses to the closest community garden in order to help build soils on some of the community garden spaces that we're using. A lot of them were on the land bank properties, so some of you might be familiar with the Summer Sprouts program that OSU Extension facilitates. And we had one of those Summer Sprouts plots, and the soil left a lot to be desired. And the other co-founder and myself, we met in Daniel Brown. We both met in Chicago while we were going to school there. We both studied philosophy. And after graduating, we moved back to Cleveland. And as you do with a lot of the liberal arts degrees, we finished our degrees and then went into working in the food service industry. So we were working in restaurants at the time and thinking a lot about this issue of food waste. We were seeing this weird phenomenon of simultaneously all these food scraps, whether it be the top of the carrot, the green part of the carrot that you don't eat, or potato peels, or just part of cooking that you're not eating that part of the food maybe, going into a landfill with a combination of also depleted soils in the region and hunger issues. So people not having access to food, and sometimes when they do have access to food, it's not access to healthy food. So it just seemed like a really high leverage point where we would be able to plug in and solve several problems while working on one particular issue, and that was food waste. And while the end game was always and still is always to be able to be working our way towards doing more food production, we realized that we needed to go to the source of this issue, which is food waste. So the title here, we've got an inconvenient story of food waste, and I think I'd like to change that to a hopeful story of food waste. So 40% of all the food in the US is wasted. It seems like a really poor use of resources. A lot of labor, cash, water, energy go into cultivating food that is ultimately sent to a landfill. Food waste also comprises the single largest component of the nation's landfills. And so that's bad because obviously a lot of energy, time, and money was wasted in cultivating that food that ultimately got thrown away. But also food waste going to landfills gives off methane, a greenhouse gas that's even more dense than CO2. It's these landfills are significantly contributing to the greenhouse gas emissions on the planet, and it's one of those greenhouse gas emitters that we don't really think about. I think that oftentimes we think about coal-fired plants or burning gasoline from our cars as being sources of CO2 emissions, which they are, but you also have sources of methane emissions. And landfills are a serious source of methane emissions, and that's due to the amount of food waste that's going into those landfills. Without getting too deep into the science of it, it's just the way in which the food waste breaks down in a landfill is different than the way it breaks down when it's composted. And the way that it breaks down in the landfill doesn't have access to oxygen, and that's what produces this methane. Daily, we could fill the Cleveland Browns Stadium with the amount of food waste that we generate in the US. Some people think that would be a better use of the stadium. Just to give you an idea of the scope of the issue. The volume is serious, and some disgruntled Browns fans think that some days it would be better filled with garbage than to be used as a football field. But either way, we want to cut that down. It's just an illustration of the volume of food waste created daily in the US. So significant problem, significant waste, and also contributing to exacerbated climate change. It is a dumb problem. There are a whole bunch of different ways to fix it, and we like to try to provide some of the solutions to that. We think that what we've got listed here are a number of reasons that the food waste occurs. Some of those things we have more control over than others. Some of those things we have more time to act on than others. So while there are some things that you can do that are listed out here, something like, saving onions, onion peels, or saving certain peels from certain vegetables to be able to use in a vegetable stock later is one creative way of not having to waste the food. There's a lot of debate around best by and use by dates, and that's also a pretty significant way to be able to push the needle in a different direction by further scrutinizing what are sometimes relatively arbitrary best by and use by dates. Thinking about some of the forces at play in terms of obviously public health should be first and foremost. There's a lot of digging into why certain best by and use by dates are set, and also getting certain foods off of the rack because they either they never make it out onto the store, into the display at the store, because they look funny. They don't meet a specification for the proportions of a banana or of an apple. For those interested, there's a really great film called, I believe it's called Wasted. There's basically a Canadian couple that lived off of food that was thrown in the dumpster that was still packaged, still within its due date, still within its use by date. And they dig in a little bit into the issues of why we see grocery stores throwing totally usable and edible food that either looks funny or there's some supply chain issues where they've got more coming in and they need to get rid of what's already on the shelves. Lots of places for improvements in terms of how we're planning both inventory in grocery stores, but also kind of how we plan our meals at home. Who wastes all of this? Like, where does the food waste come from? 43%. There's a really great organism called REFED, REFED, that has done extensive studies on the sources of food waste and the number of different solutions and the effectiveness of the different solutions. But 43% of this food waste is coming from households, 40 from businesses, and then 16% from farms. And what I mean by farms is it's sometimes what'll happen is farms grow more than what's being purchased. So that stuff just gets left out into the fields to basically get decomposed in the fields and then put back into the soils. Businesses and households are both kind of generation points of food waste that we work with. We provide the logistics solutions, basically hauling that material, saving it from going to the landfill and bringing it to be composted. Another point that I think is really important is that, and I guess I'll go back here. Now on this slide, we talk about a number of different solutions for what we call a dumb problem. And a lot of the work that we do is educational, because it seems like in our culture, there's a very linear mindset of purchase, consume, throw away. And we're not thinking in terms of systems, whether those are food systems, ecological systems, different types of nested systems, and how all of these things are connected. And so when we talk about food waste as an issue and framing different types of solutions, I think probably one of the most important things that we can do is help to reframe the mindset from one of a linear mindset to one of a cyclical mindset, or a mindset of recognizing that we live in a world in which everything is connected, and everything is part of different types of nested systems. So the concept of throwing something away, it's just false. There's no away. It goes somewhere and it has repercussions. So while we're oftentimes teaching about the ills of food waste and the negative repercussions of this material going into landfills, we're oftentimes also trying to reframe things in terms of things have to go somewhere. We live in a world of interconnectedness and a world of systems, and how can we use food waste maybe even as a metaphor to help teach that these things are all connected, and the idea that we can be isolated and waste things and not think about the long-term or even short-term at times repercussions of how we dispose of our materials. So as I mentioned before, we work with businesses and residents, the top two sources of where food waste is generated. We provide services to grocery stores, restaurants, bars, cafeterias, offices, basically any place that there's food waste being generated at a business. We've got solutions for those organizations. And then we also have a curbside pickup program where if you're generating food waste at home, you can separate the food waste out. We'll come drop off a bucket for you, a fresh bucket. We'll take your old bucket away and make sure that that material gets composted. We also have a drop-off program where you can bring us your food scraps to a local park or a nature center. We've got about 14 different locations across greater Cleveland right now where you can bring us your food scraps as a solution to help keep residential food scraps out of the landfill as well. The drop-off program that I mentioned here, this is just kind of what it looks like. Then we've also got the pickup program. And then this is where it winds up. We recently expanded onto a new facility. So you can see we're in a significantly larger space than we were previously. The material all gets brought to this site and mixed in with wood chips. We take temperatures of the piles over the course of the processing, and then it gets screened and blended into a number of different soil blends. So how compost works, I think, is it's a fun kind of thing to work through because we really like to think about compost as being something that happens. It's a biological process in which we mix a nitrogen source, which is something like that's your food waste, that's your spent grain, that's a cow manure. Sometimes it gets called the greens and the browns. Some folks might be familiar with that. Typically, the greens are the nitrogen source, even though sometimes they're brown. Like a spent brew grain from a brewery would be considered a nitrogen source. The carbon is the wood chips. They could also be dried out leaves, paper, cardboard, but we shoot for 30 to 40% nitrogen and 60 to 70% carbon. And then you really want to make sure that there's enough air and moisture in your compost pile. What we're really doing is cultivating millions and millions of microorganisms that are breaking down the material. And sometimes we like to refer to ourselves as farmers of tiny creatures. In a way, we are farming. We're farming these tiny microorganisms that break down the product, break down the food waste, and then the byproduct of them living happily is rich biodiverse compost. Those organisms in particular need air. They're aerobic organisms. And so that's the distinction I was making earlier between the landfill and the composting process. The landfilling process caps off all of that nitrogen and it doesn't have access to air. So it breaks down anaerobically, and a byproduct of anaerobic breaking down of nitrogen is methane. But when you do it aerobically, you're able to nearly get rid of nearly all of those gases and simultaneously cultivate a whole bunch of millions of organisms that break the material down, but also those organisms are really what are good for the soil and promote soil health. So a lot of times I believe that while it is important that you're introducing nutrients to the plants so that the plants can immediately take those nutrients up, for the long-term health of the plants and the soil, it's really important that you're introducing the soil microbiology at the soil level so that that biology can continue to cycle nutrients for those plants to be able to take up. We don't like forests aren't fertilized. We don't need to till forests. And that has especially in older growth forests, you have a biodiversity of organisms that are cycling the nutrients in order to mine the sand, silt, and clay that's in the soil to be able to provide plant available nutrients. for the plants. And there's some really cool relationships that happen at the soil and root level that we could talk a little bit about later too, if folks are interested. So we make this compost and then we screen it to be really fine, about 3/8 of an inch, and we use that as the main ingredient to a number of soil blends. So the soil blends can be used for a number of different applications, and the other things that we mix in tailor it for that application. So we make a soil blend for houseplants. We make a soil blend for general raised beds. We make a soil blend for starting seeds. And we also make a soil blend that is specially formulated to bring a cannabis plant from sprout to full flower without any added nutrients as well, which is pretty cool, especially in a world where a lot of things are grown using liquidizers and stuff like that. So yeah, so everything's been going really well. The potting mix is performing, on par, if not better than some of the nation's leading mixes, which is really great because a lot of organic farmers are currently shipping their potting soils and soil amendments from either the East Coast or the Rockies, is where a lot of the premier kind of experienced and really excellent soil blenders and composters are doing their work. But the idea of shipping dirt from, or shipping soils from the East Coast to the Midwest doesn't make any sense. And even some of the best companies in the U.S., like Vermont Compost, who's mentioned here, they think it's silly that they're shipping all over too from an environmental perspective. And they've been really good partners in helping us learn, because they think that there should be regional soil blenders that can provide a high quality soil to farmers and gardeners without having to ship it halfway across the country. These are what the different blends look like in their bags. And as I mentioned, Sprout is the seed starting blend. It's really great for soil blocking. It sticks together really well. Bloom is the specially formulated cannabis mix, and then Grow is for general kind of raised bed fill, and sounds like could be helpful for some of the projects that you're talking about right now. Also, I think that, as I mentioned before, we think in terms of systems and like cyclical integration. So the first step was getting a hold of the food waste and diverting that from the landfill and putting it towards compost production, and then using that compost based in a number of soil blends that are facilitating growing food in the region, bolstering food sovereignty, but also we're really excited about the opportunities to build out circular economies. It would be really great to live in a world in which the byproduct of any production process was actually an input into a different production process. And we actually have all of these kind of interconnected systems that are working in loops with one another. We think that that's important both in the immediate term, because it's going to help build food sovereignty for our communities, but also imperative for the survival of our species on the planet.